The wind rolled across the blackened shore like a living thing, lifting ash into the air until the world tasted of smoke and salt and something metallic that clung to the tongue. Broken ships lay scattered in the shallow water. The remains of a battle poets would one day turn into legend. They would call it Greece's greatest triumph, the day the Persian fleet fell and freedom was saved. They would carve stories of heroes, of commanders, of divine favor. But none of their songs would mention the voices echoing from the hills. Behind the beach, voices too sharp, too desperate, too human to fit into a victory tale. The sound wasn't the cry of warriors or the roar of clashing shields. It was thin and trembling, rising and falling like something being torn apart. It came from a long stretch of tents lying across the coastline, thousands of them shaking in the wind like a silent white forest. These were not homes for soldiers. They were cages, and inside them lived the true spoils of the war daughters of Athens, Corinth, Megara, Thebes. Women who had watched their fathers fall in the streets, who had hidden their children in wells and storerooms hoping darkness would save them. Women who thought the fires burning behind them were the worst fate possible. They were wrong. Their survival was the beginning of something far worse. That morning, as the waves slowly swallowed the remains of the Persian fleet, the real story began. And it had nothing to do with victory. The year was for 79 BC, and the sands near Salamis were still warm from the fires of war. Charred beams washed ashore beside shattered shields, and the smell of defeat clung to the air. Greece celebrated, but only from afar. Here at the shoreline, where the screams carried across the hills, triumph felt like a lie. In the rows of tents stretched along the coast sat thousands of Greek women captured, terrified, waiting for a future none of them could see. They had been taken from burning cities, dragged from hiding places, hauled from the arms of dying parents. Some had run until their lungs failed. Some had begged. Some had prayed. None of it mattered. The Persian system was efficient. It did not care who you were, only what use you could serve. These women were not prisoners for ransom. They were not trophies for celebration. They were resources, measured and sorted like grain. The Persians had a word for what they were doing. A word carved into tablets found centuries later: the yield. They were gathering the daughters of Greece, not to punish individual cities, but to weaken an entire civilization from the inside. For generations, conquerors had taken wealth, land, and soldiers. Xerxes wanted something deeper. He wanted lineage, identity, future. And he knew exactly how to take it. In the Persian view, war was not finished when the fighting stopped. Victory was complete only when the conquered people forgot who they had been. The first step began here, on this beach, where the ash of burned ships mixed with the tears of women, who still thought someone might come for them. But no one came. Persian officers moved through the rows of tents with lists and styluses, studying each woman the same way they examined captured goods. Young girls were pulled aside. Mothers were separated from daughters. The elderly were pushed toward labor groups. Anything familiar, anything that tied these women to their homes, to their gods, to their memories, was stripped away piece by piece. The screams drifting down from the hills were not the cries of battle. They were the cries of identity tearing loose from the people it belonged to. And this was only the beginning. The coastline near Salamis looked silent from far away. But anyone who walked through the rows of tents knew the truth. The Persians were not simply retreating. They were gathering what they truly wanted: the daughters of Hellas. The fighting was over, but the machinery of the empire had only just begun turning. Persian officers moved with calm discipline, as if they were handling supplies, not human beings. The women were lined up in long rows, forced to stand in the hot sun while scribes went down the line, marking clay tablets with fast, practice strokes. They took notes the same way farmers record their harvest: age, appearance, physical strength, signs of injuries. None of the women understood the words being spoken around them, but they understood the looks. They were being measured, evaluated, sorted. A tall Persian commander watched from a distance, his arms folded behind his back. His name, recorded in Greek and Persian sources alike, was Artabazos, a man who believed a conquered people could be reshaped like wet clay. He wasn't looking at the battlefield. He wasn't mourning the loss of ships or counting the dead. His attention was fixed on the groups of terrified women, as if this was the real prize of war. A girl from Megara, maybe 16, stood trembling in the line. Her legs were dusty, her tunic torn from running, her hair tangled with sand and dried sweat. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. She just stared at the ground, too exhausted to hope. When a soldier grabbed her arm and pulled her forward, her mother let out a sound that barely sounded human. She lunged toward her daughter, clawing at the soldier's arm before another guard struck her so hard she fell into the dust. The mother stayed on her knees, reaching for her child even as her vision blurred. The soldier didn't kill her. They never killed the mothers, not yet. The Persians had learned long ago that breaking a woman's spirit worked better. If her mother lived long enough to watch it happen, the girl was taken into a nearby tent where a scribe waited with a small flat table. Clay tablets were stacked neatly beside him. He didn't ask her name. He didn't comfort her. He observed her like an object, checking her teeth, her posture, her skin, the way she carried her weight. Then he wrote everything down with cold precision. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a category, a piece of data to be shipped east. Many such tablets have been found in the ruins of ancient Persian cities. One of them, translated centuries later, listed women taken from Athens, Thebes, and Corinth. The line that haunts historians reads simply, "Condition acceptable." The empire reduced the daughters of Greece to a checkbox on an inventory list. But the worst part was not the capture. It was what came next. Women between 13 and 25, the age group most valuable in the Persian assimilation system, were kept under strict watch. They were not immediately taken east. Instead, they were held in coastal camps across Asia Minor. These places were not torture chambers. They were something colder, something more calculated. They were reshaping centers. The Persians had discovered a truth older than war itself. If you want to erase a people, you erase the generation that will carry its memories. So the training began. Greek girls were forced to speak Persian, their native words punished or ignored. They were taught how to bow, how to stand, how to prepare food, how to dress in ways that felt strange and humiliating. They learned prayers to gods they did not believe in. They were rewarded for obedience and starved for refusal. Every rule had a purpose: strip away the identity, fill the emptiness with something new. Some broke quickly, others held out for weeks. A few resisted for months. The ones who resisted longest were the first to disappear. Archaeologists discovered a mass grave near Sardis decades ago. Inside were the remains of more than 300 women, all showing signs of starvation, injury, and exhaustion. Their skulls were positioned facing west, toward Greece. Even in death, they turned their faces homeward. By late 479 BC, the first groups of Greek captives were placed on ships bound for Susa, the administrative heart of the empire. None of them knew what waited there, but the Persian officials did. They had built this system carefully, perfecting it through generations of conquest. They weren't simply taking prisoners, they were taking the future of Greece. The palaces of Susa gleamed under the sun with golden roofs and towering columns unlike anything the girls had ever seen. Gardens stretched for miles, filled with flowers they didn't know the names of. This was the center of Persian power. This was where identities vanish. And it was here that the next chapter of their lives they never asked for would begin. Susa was a world far from anything a Greek captive could imagine. The moment the girls stepped off the ships, the heat pressed against their skin like a second body. Towering columns rose into the sky, carved with lions and winged bulls. The floors shone like polished mirrors. Every breath tasted of incense and spices, sweet, strange, unfamiliar. Everything around them seemed designed to remind them they did not belong. Persian guards led the women through long corridors lined with painted tiles. None of the girls spoke. They had learned by now that silence was safer than hope. Some clutched the hems of their torn clothes. Others stared blankly ahead, their minds already slipping somewhere far away. If anyone cried, the tears left no sound. At the center of Susa stood the palace complex, the place where the royal harem operated. Greeks would later imagine it as a house of pleasure, full of silk and luxury. But the truth was far more political. The harem was not a playground. It was a factory, a system designed to turn daughters of conquered nations into instruments of Persian expansion. The Papyrus tablets, preserved by fire centuries later, reveal how exact the system was. Women were divided into strict ranks. At the bottom were domestic workers, the ones who served food, cleaned floors, washed clothes. Above them were attendants who assisted noble families. Then came concubines, those chosen for their youth or beauty. And at the highest tier were the women assigned to bear children for Persian nobles, not out of affection, not out of desire, but because their mixed-blood children would be useful to the empire. It was not romance. It was strategy. A 15-year-old Greek girl named Plataea arrived around this time. Her name appears on a fading Babylonian tablet. She refused to accept the new rules. She resisted the language lessons. She refused the clothing they gave her, tearing it apart every night. She would not bow. She would not lower her eyes. She held on to the last pieces of her identity like a flame cupped in trembling hands. The Persians did not beat her. They did not kill her. They broke her slowly. They sent her to the weaving halls, vast rooms filled with rows of looms. She worked 14 hours a day, weaving until her fingers bled. She slept alone on a bare mat. She was given almost no food. She was not allowed to speak to the other Greek women. The officials understood that isolation, cold, empty silence was the sharpest knife. After 8 months, Plataea collapsed. The tablet lists her cause of death as exhaustion. That single word hides everything she endured. But not every Greek woman died in the system. Some survived. Some learned to bend rather than break. And for those who adapted, the transformation was slow but complete. A letter found in Bactria, written by a woman named Roxane, a Greek name. Bright in meaning, but dim in context, shows the final stage of assimilation. Her writing is delicate, brief, carved by someone who no longer dreamed of home. She wrote to her sister in Thessaly, I am alive. I speak their language now. I follow their customs. The king's steward has taken me as a secondary wife. I have a son. He is beautiful. His eyes remind me of yours. But he will never know your name. Do not look for me. I am not the person I was. That last line is the truth that chills the soul. Roxane survived the system, but she did not survive as herself. She became what the empire designed her to be, an instrument of its future. This was the deepest cruelty. Not the physical suffering, not the loss of home, but the slow erasing of who these women had been. Their children would speak Persian, worship Persian gods, serve Persian rulers. They would never carry the stories of Greece in their hearts. They would never know the songs their mothers once sang. The empire didn't just capture bodies, it captured bloodlines. By the middle of the 5th century BC, thousands of children born from Greek captives were already serving as scribes, translators, and administrators across Persian territory. Some even governed regions their mothers once called home. Xerxes hadn't simply wanted to win a war. He wanted to reshape the future. And in the halls of Susa, in the gardens where foreign flowers grew, in the chambers where Greek mothers rocked Persian sons, that future was being carved day by day. If you're ready, I will continue this path of forgotten history. Not every Greek woman stayed in Susa forever. A small number, very small, found their way back to Greece in the years after the Persian Wars. Some were released by wealthy Persian families who no longer needed them. Others were ransomed by relatives who had spent years searching. A few escaped when political tensions shifted. But for nearly all of them, the return home was not the miracle they imagined. Home had changed, and so had they. One of the earliest accounts comes from the city of Eretria. An inscription from around 460 BC tells the story of a woman named Harmonia. She had been taken by the Persians at 16. She returned 12 years later with a young boy, maybe 6 years old, holding her hand. His hair was dark like hers, but his eyes carried a different shape, the unmistakable mark of Persian blood. Harmonia stepped back onto the soil of her homeland, expecting tears, embraces, the warmth of familiar faces. Instead, she was met with silence, then whispers, then rejection. Her city refused to recognize her citizenship. Her relatives refused to take her in. She had lived with Persians. She had carried a child for one, and in the eyes of her people, that made her unclean. The legal record is brutal in its simplicity. She has been touched by the enemy. That one sentence erased her entire life. Harmonia tried to plead for her son, but no one would hear her. The boy was considered a foreigner, a threat, a reminder of humiliation. The inscription ends without saying what happened to them. To lives vanish into silence. She was not the only one. Greek historian Theopompus, writing more than a century later, mentioned these returning women only briefly. He called them the silent ones, women who moved through the markets and temples like shadows, women who could not speak about what they had endured, women who were alive, but not truly part of any world, not Persia, not Greece. They walk among us. Theopompus wrote, but they belong nowhere. As years passed, the world tried to forget them. Memory bent itself toward the heroes of the battlefield, the men who won glory, the cities that rose again. The stories of the women did not fit the proud Greek identity being rebuilt. The poets did not write about them. The statues did not honor them. The plays did not name them. But the ground remembered. Archaeologists in modern times uncovered graves across regions once touched by Persian occupation. Many belonged to young women whose bones showed signs of malnutrition, long-term labor, and childbirth at painfully early ages. One grave near ancient Thebes contained a woman no older than 22. Beside her lay a small clay tablet. The message on it was carved in shaky Greek letters. I am daughter of no one. I am mother of no one. I am the forgotten. Remember that I was. Her name has been erased by time, but her voice survived in that small piece of clay. A voice the poets never recorded. And this is where history becomes unsettling. Because the deeper you dig, the more the pattern becomes clear. Greece won the war. But Greece did not save its daughters. The victories at Salamis and Plataea became symbols of freedom. But behind those victories were thousands of women who never truly came home. Thousands who were changed, broken, reshaped, or erased. The world calls it victory. Their bones tell a different story. What Persia began with force, Greece completed with silence. The women taken east disappeared. The ones who returned were lost in a different way. No one wanted to speak their names. No one wanted to acknowledge the cost carved into their lives. And slowly, century by century, their stories thinned until they survived only in fragmented scratched tablets, simple inscriptions, scattered remains. Yet what happened to them mattered more than any battlefield strategy. What they endured shows the real price of empire. The kind written not in stories of kings and generals, but in the quiet suffering of those who had no voice, because it wasn't swords that destroyed these women. It was being forgotten. The deeper you follow this story, the clearer the truth becomes. Xerxes did not fail in every part of his plan. His armies lost the great battle Salamis, Plataea, but the quiet strategy he set in motion continued long after the last spear fell. The Persians understood something most empires never learned. Conquering land is temporary. Conquering identity lasts for generations. By the middle of the 5th century BC, the children born from Greek mothers and Persian fathers were no longer rare. They filled the courts of Asia Minor, worked in the scribal halls of Susa, and served in administrative posts across the empire. They translated laws, managed cities, collected taxes, and carried out orders in lands their mothers once called home. They spoke fluent Persian. They prayed to Persian gods. They lived as loyal servants of the king. They were living proof of a painful truth: the erasing of a people does not happen with fire. It happens quietly, through children who grow up never knowing the world their mothers lost. While Greek cities rebuilt their temples and raised statues to celebrate victory, the real consequences of war were unfolding far away, in palace rooms and distant provinces. The Persian Empire did not need to hold Greek soil to leave its mark. It had already taken something deeper. This is why ancient texts feel incomplete. Herodotus, the famous historian of the Persian Wars, described battles in great detail, listing generals, strategies, troop movements. But when it came to the civilians taken east, he offered only one line: many were captured, and in time some returned. That single sentence hides an entire world of suffering, but physical evidence reveals more than any historian was willing to write. Hundreds of clay tablets found in Persia record the daily lives of these Greek women and their children: rations, assignments, punishments, transfers. One tablet lists a group of young Greek women sent to work in royal kitchens. Another describes children of mixed parentage assigned to tutoring posts. These records are cold, factual, emotionless, but reading them, you can feel the shadow of the lives behind them. And then there are the graves. In several regions of Greece, especially where Persian influence had been strongest, archaeologists found burials of young women whose skeletons told stories the poets never would. Bones marked by long labor, ribs showing signs of malnutrition, pelvic injuries indicating childbirth before adulthood. These were the women who returned, the ones who survived only to die quietly in their homeland, forgotten by the very cities they longed to see again. One grave stands out more than most. It was found near ancient Thebes. The woman inside was barely 20, but what lay beside her is what pierced the heart of every scholar who studied it. A small tablet with a message carved by a shaking hand. It is written that Greece won, but I have lost everything. Her world had collapsed while others celebrated. Her suffering did not fit into the heroic stories Greece wanted to tell. This is why empires prefer silence. Silence hides the cost. Silence lets victors pretend they paid nothing. Silence erases the women who carried the heaviest burdens of war. Plutarch, centuries later, wrote a line that now feels like a prophecy: we remember the men who win wars. We forget the women who survived them. The forgotten women are the real lesson here. Their lives remind us that the destruction of a people does not require chains or flames. All it takes is for their voices to be ignored. And that is what happened to the daughters of Hellas. Their bodies were taken. Their names were taken. And in the end, their stories were taken too. But the empire's most disturbing success was not in the women it destroyed. It was in the generations that followed, generations who grew up never knowing their mother's songs, their prayers, their language. Generations raised as children of Persia, not Greece. This is the true shape of erasure. It does not shout. It whispers, and the world moves on without noticing. As the years passed, the story of what happened to the daughters of Hellas drifted further into the shadows. Greece celebrated its victories. Poets recited brave tales of warriors and gods. Cities rose from ashes. Statues of heroes filled the temples. Yet with every new marble monument, the memory of the women taken east slipped a little further from the world's tongue. Their tragedy did not fit the tale of triumph Greece wanted to tell. But history cannot be buried forever. The truth surfaced again, not in poems, but in the cold earth beneath forgotten ground. Archaeologists digging through lands once touched by Persian armies found signs of a hidden history. Graves of young women with bones bent by labor, ribs narrowed by hunger, and marks that spoke of childbirth long before their bodies were grown. These graves were quiet, but they spoke louder than any epic. One burial in particular left scholars stunned. A woman no older than 20, her bones thin, her limbs marked by stress. Beside her lay a small clay tablet. The writing was uneven, carved by someone whose hands trembled as they worked. It read, "I returned. But my home did not." 6 words that carried centuries of pain. These discoveries reveal something Greece never wanted to confront. Victory on the battlefield did not mean safety for everyone. Thousands of women never returned, and those who did were treated as strangers, tainted, contaminated by the enemy. The people who had suffered the most were the ones Greece chose to forget. This is the dark truth. Empires destroy with swords, but they erase with silence. The Persian plan worked not because of cruelty alone, but because it used patience. It reshaped entire generations slowly and quietly. A Greek child born in Persia grew up speaking Persian, not Greek, ate Persian food, not Greek, worshipped Persian gods, not the ones their mothers had whispered about when they were small. Within 2 generations, the children of Greek captives stood in Persian courts serving the empire. Some governed border regions, some handled taxes, some helped manage the very territories their ancestors had once defended. They belonged fully to Persia. They had no memory of Hellas except through the eyes of mothers who barely dared to speak. This was the real war, one fought not with weapons, but with identity. Meanwhile, Greece wrote its histories. The great writers focused on battles, armor, ships, alliances, kings. They praised courage and strategy. They spoke of freedom and honor. But in these long accounts, the women appear only as shadows, mentioned briefly, if at all. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote page after page about the Persian invasion. But when it came to the thousands taken east, he wrote merely 1 line: some were taken. And in time some returned. A single sentence for thousands of stolen lives. And so their stories faded. Not because they weren't important, but because no one wanted to remember them. Greece preferred the clean version of its victory, with shining heroes and noble sacrifices, not the version where its daughters suffered quietly in faraway lands. But the clay tablets recovered from ruined palaces tell the truth anyway. They list Greek names twisted into Persian versions. They describe rations, punishments, training schedules. They document marriages arranged for political use. They show the daily life of a machine built to erase the identity of captives, without shedding a drop of blood. What happened to the daughters of Hellas was not an accident of war. It was a structure, a policy, a strategy. Xerxes lost the war, but part of his vision succeeded. He understood something chilling, that a people is not defeated when its cities fall, but when its future changes shape. And in the quiet rooms of Susa, in the chambers where Greek mothers held children who would never know Greece, that future was rewritten one life at a time. The tragedy of the daughters of Hellas reaches its sharpest point when you understand what survived and what did not. The Persian Empire eventually weakened. Greek cities rose in power. Future generations look back on the war as a moment of triumph. But the women who were taken east left almost no trace in the stories told afterward. Their pain did not become legend. Their names did not enter the poems. Their memories were carried only in small fragments carved into clay, whispered in inscriptions, buried in graves that no one visited. Yet the consequences of their erasure echoed through centuries. When Greece rebuilt itself after the Persian Wars, it built a version of history that felt clean and triumphant. A story where good defeated evil, where courage conquered fear, where freedom triumphed over tyranny. It was a beautiful story, almost comforting, but it was incomplete. Behind the bright shield of victory, there was a darkness no one wanted to speak about. The truth was that Greece did not protect its daughters. The ones who returned were not welcomed. Some were pushed into poverty. Some were cast out entirely. Some lived on the edges of the cities they once called home, watching people celebrate victories bought with their suffering. A historian named Plutarch, writing long after those events, understood this silence too well. He said, "We honor those who fought, but we forget those who paid." He was speaking of these women. Though he never named them directly, the world had already begun to forget. Meanwhile, the Persian strategy continued to work in ways Greece never saw. The children of Greek captives became threads woven into the Persian political fabric. They served as translators, soldiers, negotiators, and governors. They were loyal because they had been raised to be loyal. Their mothers, who once whispered Greek lullabies, learned to stay silent. Their children listened only to the empire. By the time Xerxes died, the line between conqueror and conquered had already blurred. The Persian courts were filled with people whose ancestry stretched across oceans and mountains. They spoke many languages, but they served one master. This was not forced obedience, it was crafted identity. This is the part of history that terrifies scholars even today. Empires do not always destroy with fire. Sometimes they destroy by changing the future so slowly, so quietly, that no one realizes what has been lost until it is gone forever. And the most frightening truth is this: silence is more powerful than any weapon. Once a story is not told, it becomes as if it never happened. Once a voice goes unheard, it fades. Once a name is unspoken, it disappears. That is what happened to the daughters of Hellas. Not just their bodies, but their memories. Their lives were rewritten in foreign languages. Their children grew up with new customs. Their stories dissolved like sand carried off by wind. A few resisted in small ways, holding onto a song, a prayer, a word. But resistance without a witness becomes a whisper lost to time. Yet their presence still lingers. Clay tablets still hold their transformed names. Abandoned graves still carry their final messages. Fragments of their voices reach us through broken inscriptions. I want to remember who I was. I came home, but I was not home. I was taken, and I was unmade. These simple lines cut deeper than battle stories filled with heroes and kings, because they remind us that history is often written by those who shout the loudest while those who suffer quietly are left in the dark. But the daughters of Hellas did leave traces. They left enough for us to follow, enough to rebuild the truth piece by piece, enough to understand the price that was paid while the world celebrated victory. Their story is not one of defeat, it is one of survival in silence, a survival so heavy it outlived the memory of their own names. You have followed this story through the ashes of Salamis, the camps of Asia Minor, the halls of Susa, and the graves of forgotten daughters. Now we reach the part that historians rarely speak about, the part where the silence becomes the final weapon. Xerxes' armies lost their great battles. His ships burned, his soldiers fell. But the plan he built around the daughters of Hellas did not die with the war. It lived inside those women, inside the children they bore, inside the generations that grew up far from the lands their mothers once loved. This was not a victory you could carve into stone. It was a victory that changed bloodlines. Within a few decades, the Persian Empire was filled with mixed heritage officials who had never set foot in Greece but carried Greek ancestry in their veins. These young men spoke Persian, followed Persian laws, and served Persian rulers. Some became administrators, some became soldiers. Some governed territories their mothers had been taken from. The erasure had been successful. It was quiet, patient, and devastating. Greece never told this part of the story. It was easier to remember the battles, to honor the heroes, to celebrate the freedom won on the sea. Harder to speak of what happened to the women who vanished into the east. Harder to face the truth that victory on the battlefield does not save everyone. Plutarch wrote centuries later, "We name the generals, but the price of war is paid by those who are unnamed." He did not mention the daughters of Hellas directly, but his words fit them more than anyone else. They paid a price carved not into marble, but into their lives. Yet the story did not end with silence. Time uncovered what memory tried to bury. Clay tablets survived fires, inscriptions survived decay. Forgotten graves waited beneath the soil with messages carved by shaking hands. Each piece, each line, each unearthed bone whispered the truth back into the world. It is because of these fragments that we can still hear the voices of women who were never meant to be remembered. I am the one they took. I am the one they changed. Let someone remember that I lived. These voices matter because they remind us that history is not just the story of kings and armies. It is also the story of the people who slipped between the lines, the ones who carried the quiet weight of empires. What Xerxes did to the daughters of Hellas was not a simple act of cruelty. It was a strategy designed to erase their identity and replace it with something new. A strategy that worked for 2 generations and left a scar deeper than any sword could make. And yet, the most powerful truth is this: they are not gone. Their bodies may have been taken. Their names may have been lost. Their stories may have been buried. But we can still hear them when we choose to look at the evidence instead of the legend. Their voices survived because someone wrote them into clay. Someone carved their pain into stone. Someone buried them with messages meant to outlast forgetting. And now, by reading their history, by speaking their story again, we return to them the one thing they were denied: memory. You have reached the end of one of ancient history's most hidden tragedies. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to the cost paid by people who never held a sword, then carry it with you. Stories like this survive only when someone refuses to let them fade.